Yeah, that was one where actually got one of the scars on my head because the cage door got slammed into my head. X-Pac did that. And
At 59, Kane no longer hides behind the mask or the storylines that once protected the truth. He talks plainly now, and the word he uses is hate. Not the playful kind fans saw on television. This was the hate that came from unsafe spots, backstage politics, broken promises, and moments when he felt like his body was being used as a tool rather than respected as a partner. Kane spent years carrying the weight of fire angles, cage falls, chair shots, and monster pressure that pushed him deeper than most wrestlers ever had to go. Every bump felt heavier because he was expected to survive anything. That pressure created 5 names he could never forget. 5 men who forced him to step into matches he knew would hurt him. 5 men he truly hated. Here is the countdown. Kane was born Glenn Jacobs in 1967, raised far from the spotlight that would one day define him. Before WWE, he built a reputation as a powerful athlete who understood discipline more than fame. When he arrived in the company in the mid-90s, he stepped into a locker room ruled by intensity, politics, and competition for every inch of attention. His size made him valuable, but his discipline made him trusted. That trust placed him in dangerous storylines, heavy matches, and roles that demanded more than most careers could survive. From this world came the 5 wrestlers he hated the most. Number 5 is X-Pac, a name that surprises fans who only remember the tag team run and the unlikely chemistry they showed on television. But the truth behind the curtain was far heavier for Kane than anyone realized. Working with X-Pac meant keeping up with a smaller, faster wrestler who relied on high-speed combinations and sudden impact defense, and that style demanded a level of timing that punished Kane's body every night. The difference in size made every strike feel sharper, every landing feel harder. And Kane was the one who had to adjust, absorb, and protect the match from falling apart. He never complained publicly, but backstage he felt the pressure of carrying the weight of their pairing while X-Pac was treated as the star of the story. The tension grew when certain spots were rehearsed lightly but executed recklessly, leaving Kane to take the full force of bumps that were never meant to hit that hard. He hated the feeling of standing in the ring knowing that one mistimed kick or a rushed leap could injure him while he was the one expected to maintain control. There were nights when X-Pac pushed the pace too far, forcing Kane to chase a rhythm that worked for the smaller man but punished the larger one. Kane hated that imbalance because it added a risk he felt was unnecessary. Even worse were the angles that positioned Kane as the emotional anchor of the storyline, while X-Pac received the spotlight, the sympathy, and the creative focus. Kane had to sell betrayal, heartbreak, and fury, while also covering for moves that did not always land cleanly. In private moments, he admitted that the frustration reached a level that crossed into hate, not because X-Pac was cruel, but because the dynamic made Kane feel used, overlooked, and physically threatened every time a match grew too chaotic. He remembered a match where a misjudged spinning kick caught him in the jaw harder than planned, snapping his head back and forcing him to finish the bout half-dazed. Kane held the rope afterward and breathed through the pain while agents praised X-Pac for his performance. That moment crystallized the resentment he had been holding in. He hated the imbalance between effort and recognition, hated the expectation that he would endure damage without complaint, and hated realizing that fans believed their partnership worked smoothly when backstage the tension was grinding him down. X-Pac was never his enemy outside the ring, but inside it, Kane carried a weight that made every match feel like a test he never asked for. And that is why X-Pac stands as the 5th wrestler Kane hated the most. Number 4 is Shane McMahon, the one man in WWE who treated danger like a personal challenge and turned every match into a stunt reel. For most wrestlers, a risky moment was rare. For Shane, it was the plan. That attitude made Kane hate working with him more than almost anyone else. Shane's energy was wild, unpredictable, and driven by a desire to impress the audience at any cost. And Kane was always the one positioned to catch the fall, absorb the impact, or stand inside the blast zone of whatever insane idea Shane wanted to execute. Kane respected toughness, but he hated recklessness, and Shane blurred that line every time they shared a ring. Their 2003 feud looked spectacular to fans. Yet behind the curtain, it demanded a level of physical sacrifice that Kane never forgot. Every segment required fire, explosions, or a stunt that risked serious injury, and Kane hated that he was expected to stabilize the chaos while Shane launched himself into danger without thinking of the man who had to make the landing safe. In one backstage moment before a pay-per-view, Shane pitched a spot that involved a high leap onto Kane through equipment that had barely been tested. Kane stared at the setup knowing that if even one angle shifted, he would take the full force of the fall. He hated standing in those moments, knowing he had to protect a man who refused to protect himself. The last man standing match between them became the perfect example of why Kane carried such resentment. Shane pushed his body to extremes, climbing structures, running headfirst into spots that demanded Kane hold the entire match together. The production team praised Shane for his courage, and fans celebrated the spectacle. But Kane walked backstage feeling the bruises, the soreness, and the weight of responsibility that no one else saw. He hated how the narrative made Shane look fearless while Kane looked monstrous, even though Kane was the one preserving the safety of the match. He felt like a professional forced into babysitting a stunt performer rather than sharing a ring with a wrestler. Another moment that fueled the hate came after a chaotic segment involving electrical equipment where Shane insisted on repeating a risky sequence that had already gone wrong once during rehearsal. Kane voiced concern, but the scene went ahead, and the result was a landing that rattled Kane's spine. He kept the match alive, but backstage he sat silently for minutes, breathing through the shock and thinking about how easily the night could have ended with real damage. That memory stayed with him long after the feud ended. Kane never denied Shane's heart, but he hated the danger that followed him. He hated the backstage pressure to perform stunts that were unnecessary. He hated the expectation that his size made him invincible. Shane McMahon was not the man who hurt Kane emotionally or politically. He was the man who made Kane feel that every match could be the one that went too far. And that kind of fear, mixed with frustration, formed a hate that never fully left him. Number 3 is Batista, a name tied to one of the most political periods in Kane's career. Batista was rising fast, powered by the momentum of evolution, and backed by creative decisions that placed him at the center of WWE's future. Kane understood the business, but understanding it did not erase the frustration of being used as a stepping stone during Batista's ascent. He hated how often the booking pushed him aside to make Batista look unstoppable, and he hated the quiet message behind those choices, the idea that his work, his longevity, and his sacrifice were all secondary to someone newer and more marketable. The tension began in the early 2000s, when Kane was still delivering heavy matches night after night, yet found himself repeatedly positioned to lose to Batista in ways that felt less about story and more about corporate direction. Kane was expected to make Batista look powerful, which he did, but the pattern made him feel diminished. It bothered him that the matches were rarely built around two monsters clashing. Instead, they were designed to elevate Batista while Kane absorbed the impact. He hated seeing segments rewritten moments before airtime so Batista could have the final shot, the final pose, or the final moment of dominance. One night backstage, Kane learned that a planned competitive match had been changed without warning. Instead of a physical, balanced battle, the new version had Batista overpowering him from the opening moments, ending with Kane lying flat to sell a victory that did not match their real physical dynamics. Kane handled it professionally, but inside he hated the disrespect. He hated being treated as a tool to polish someone else's rise, rather than a star in his own right. The frustration grew during live events, where the agents insisted Batista needed to look stronger every night because the company had long-term plans for him. Kane was told his role was to enhance, not compete. And he hated how those words echoed the political environment that shaped that era. The breaking point came when Batista's push became overwhelming, and Kane realized his own momentum had been sacrificed entirely. He watched Batista receive opportunities he had earned through years of loyalty and grueling matches. Yet Kane's contributions were overshadowed by the machine behind Batista. He hated that imbalance. He hated the politics that chose one future and dismissed the veteran who had held the show together for so long. Their matches were physical, but the real fight was backstage. where Kane quietly carried the resentment of knowing that his body was being used to send a message about Batista's dominance. Even though Kane respected Batista's intensity and understood the business logic, the emotional truth was simple. That era made Kane feel expendable, and he hated the power structure that allowed it. That is why Batista stands as the third wrestler Kane hated the most. Number 2 is Triple H, the name that defined an entire era of power, control, and booking influence. An era Kane felt more than almost anyone else in the locker room. During the early 2000s, Triple H stood at the center of WWE's creative direction, and his position allowed him to shape not only storylines, but the momentum of every wrestler who crossed his path. Kane hated working in that environment because he felt the imbalance every time their careers intersected. Matches against Triple H rarely served both men equally. Instead, they were structured to reinforce Triple H's domination during the period fans now call the Reign of Terror. Kane entered many of those matches with confidence, but backstage he knew the outcome before the bell rang. He hated that his role was predetermined as the man who pushed Triple H to the edge but never crossed the line to victory. The resentment became sharper in 2003 when Kane lost his mask. A moment set up as dramatic, but executed in a way that made him feel stripped rather than elevated. He knew the decision came from a creative desk influenced heavily by Triple H's perspective. And although Kane adapted professionally, the emotional weight stayed with him. Losing the mask changed his entire identity. It removed the aura he had built for years and left him exposed in a way he hated. He believed the angle could have been a massive turning point for his career, but instead it became a tool in Triple H's larger narrative. Every time their feud continued, Kane saw pieces of his character rewritten to make Triple H look stronger. Another moment that fed the hate occurred during a backstage meeting where agents discussed the direction of their next match. Kane suggested a finish that protected both men, but the concept was dismissed immediately because it did not align with Triple H's momentum. Kane sat quietly as the room shifted toward yet another dominant win for Triple H. And inside, he hated the feeling of being overruled by influence rather than logic. He hated that the creative process had become predictable, that whenever he stood across from Triple H, the outcome was predetermined not by story but by politics. Even in matches where Kane delivered some of the most physical performances of his career, the aftermath always placed Triple H back on top. That repetition wore Kane down. He felt trapped in a cycle where his effort, his reliability, and his toughness were used to reinforce another man's legacy. He hated how often he was asked to lose clean, lose decisively, or lose in ways that made him look permanently diminished. Kane never blamed Triple H personally for every decision, but he hated the system that allowed one man to shape the careers of so many others, himself included. He hated being a casualty of that power. That is why Triple H stands as the second wrestler Kane hated the most. Number 1 is The Undertaker, the man fans always believed stood closest to Kane, the partner in myth, the brother in storyline, the figure tied to every major chapter of his career. But behind that bond was a pressure that Kane carried alone, a pressure that slowly evolved into a quiet, unspoken hate. Not personal hate, professional hate. The kind that forms when your entire identity is built in the shadow of someone who can never be matched. From the moment Kane debuted, he was designed to elevate The Undertaker. Every fire, every roar, every devastating attack was constructed to make the eventual confrontation even bigger. That role trapped Kane in a narrative that always ended the same way. Undertaker was the immovable icon. Kane was the monster built to fall. Kane hated living inside that inevitability, but he hated knowing that every rivalry between them would end with him lying on the mat while Undertaker stood tall. He hated that their story was written as a cycle he could never break, no matter how strong he looked or how brutal his performances became. WrestleMania 14. Their early battles in '98, the reunions, the betrayals, the countless returns, all of it carried the same weight. Undertaker was the mythical force. Kane was the reminder that no monster could surpass him. What made the hate sharper was the backstage reality. Undertaker was the locker room leader, the respected voice, the man whose presence shaped decisions long before Kane ever heard them. Kane respected him deeply, but he hated the consequences of that power. Creative rarely gave Kane a true victory in their feud, because Undertaker's legacy came first. That meant Kane absorbed the losses, the dramatic reveals, the emotional angles that stripped away his dominance piece by piece. He hated the expectation that his character existed to strengthen Undertaker's legacy rather than build his own. In 2010, during one of their final major storylines, Kane finally received a rare series of wins, but even then, he knew the tide would turn back. The narrative was already set. Undertaker was the benchmark, and Kane was the foil who made that benchmark look unbreakable. He hated that truth, even as he accepted it. One moment that stayed with him came after a long match, where Kane felt he had delivered one of the strongest performances of his career. He walked backstage proud of the work, only to hear agents praise Undertaker for carrying the emotion of the story. Kane smiled and nodded, but inside he hated how invisible his contribution felt. Undertaker never disrespected him, but the structure of their careers forced Kane into a permanent secondary role. That dynamic created a hate shaped by pressure, by identity, and by the knowledge that his greatest storyline was also the one that held him down. Undertaker was the rival Kane could never surpass, the shadow he could never escape, and the one man who defined both his rise and his restraint. That is why, above all others, The Undertaker is the wrestler Kane hated the most. Kane's career was shaped by violence, spectacle, and the constant demand to be the man who absorbed every impact without breaking. When he looks back at the 5 wrestlers he hated the most, he does not think about personal grudges. He thinks about pressure, danger, and the moments that forced him to sacrifice more than anyone ever saw. X-Pac pushed his limits through chaotic pacing. Shane McMahon dragged him into stunts that risked his body every night. Batista represented the politics that pushed Kane aside to build a new star. Triple H embodied the power that controlled Kane's momentum, and The Undertaker cast the shadow that defined his entire identity. Kane survived all of them, even when the business demanded more than he believed he could give. Hate, for him, was never about anger. It was the weight of responsibility, the cost of loyalty, and the quiet truth that every rivalry leaves a mark. The question now is simple. Which wrestler should we uncover next?